Thank you for tuning in to today's webinar. I'm Jesse Anderson, a Data Standards Lead in the Office of Computational Science within CDER at FDA, and I'm here with Sam Hume from CDISC, and we are here to talk to you today about the Dataset-JSON pilot report and next steps. This is a standard disclaimer. The views and opinions presented here are our own and should not be considered to represent advice or guidance on behalf of the FDA. Here's today's agenda. I'll talk about the Dataset-JSON pilot and the pilot results, and then I will turn it over to Sam, who will talk more about the technical findings and next steps. So first up, the Dataset-JSON pilot. So this is the project timeline. As you can see, the pilot itself really got started last year in May of 2023. The pilot kickoff meeting happened in July, and we've done several presentations over the course of the past year to talk more about it and to spread the word. This culminated in the completion of the clinical data pilot in December of 2023. We completed the non-clinical data pilot in April 2024, and we released the final report in June. And this is the presentation to talk more about the findings from this pilot. So there were 4 sub-teams as part of this FUSE project. Really, the focus of this presentation is going to be on the pilot submissions report and the technical implementation sub-teams. So first, I will go through the pilot submissions report. So in terms of the pilot goals, there's really 2 of them, a short-term and a more long-term one. In terms of the short-term goal, our aim was to show that the JSON format was the same content and a different suitcase with no disruption to the business process on either side. This also allowed FDA to evaluate how our internal tools can support the JSON format. The success criteria is to demonstrate that Dataset-JSON can transport information with no disruption to business. The second, more long-term goal here is to develop a future strategy, so evaluating how current and future industry standards can benefit without the XBT limitations. So as you know, the variable names must be no longer than 8 characters. How can we change anything that would benefit industry here? What about labels? What about data, etc.? And also evaluating combining metadata with the data sets themselves. So evaluating defined XMLs and whether there would be a value in having a defined JSON, that kind of thing. And then there's also the possibility of enhanced conformance rules. And FDA is also utilizing these findings to evaluate any tool redevelopment plans to consume JSON files natively so we don't have to run into those XBT limitations anymore. And the success criteria here is to demonstrate the viability of Dataset-JSON as a primary transport option for regulatory submissions. In terms of pilot strategy, there are really 3 different phases here. There was the initial testing, the external testing, and then evaluating the findings. So the first phase was initial testing, where we really wanted to create a low barrier to entry to allow as many companies as possible to test this. So industry and FDA both completed internal testing, utilizing the CDISC hackathon tools to test their own data, to see how it worked for them and to provide any feedback to us. Then we had external testing where industry volunteers agreed to submit test regulatory JSON submissions via the Test Electronic Study Gateway, or ESG. And this allowed FDA to confirm that we were able to receive both XBT and JSON submissions and confirm that the data integrity was there for both of them. And then the final stage was to evaluate the findings. So the team reviewed the findings from both the questionnaires submitted by industry as well as the FDA testing, and then we are reporting out on the findings to industry, and CDISC will address the issues identified in Dataset-JSON version 1.1. So moving on to pilot results. In terms of the summary of findings, so overall, the results showed there were minor date representation, display format issues, and precision concerns. And if you click into this slide that's available to you, you can click on the full findings listing at that link, and you can take a look at the full list of findings. In terms of addressing those findings, there's 3 separate ways that could be used in order to address them. So in terms of, it could be standards updates with the next version of Dataset-JSON version 1.1. There's updating user guide content, which Sam will go through in a bit. And there's also the possibility of tool updates and enhancements, which Sam will also talk about. And many of the findings are related to conversion tools and interoperability testing between two different tools. And Sam will go through that during the technical implementation discussion. In terms of pilot conclusions, we believe that milestone 1 has been satisfied. We've shown that Dataset-JSON can transport information with no disruption to business and is viable as the primary transport option. It should be noted that FDA testing that showed to date, cost analytical tools cannot accept JSON files. So updates will be necessary for full implementation of Dataset-JSON as a transport file for regulatory data. FDA staff are working with external vendors and folks internally to be able to implement these changes soon, and we hope to do so in the near future. We also showed that Dataset-JSON files successfully tested and submitted test ESG submissions to the FDA with no data integrity issues as confirmed by OCS. And the Dataset-JSON version 1.1 will be completed by the end of this year to address the pilot findings. Now I'll turn it over to Sam, who will talk more about the technical implementation findings.
Again, I'm Sam Hume, and I'm going to get into a bit more detail on the pilot findings and how we address those findings in the Dataset-JSON standard itself via an updated version that we've started to work on. From my perspective, the pilot outcome was about as optimal as we could hope for, in that, one, we achieved our major milestone by demonstrating that Dataset-JSON can indeed carry the same content as SAS version 5 transport without negatively impacting business processes. But secondly, and equally importantly, we learned a lot about the standard itself and how to improve it. And we are in the process of applying that in an updated version of the standard. I'm going to cover some of that detail here momentarily. So this content that I'll cover today was authored by the Technical Implementation Pilot Subteam, and it does get into a little bit of detail covering the findings, what we learned from the pilot, essentially what was reported by the testers, but it also covers the solutions that we're working on to address the findings. And if you're interested in more detail on this than I'm able to get through today, there are more findings available in the FHUSE pilot report, as well as more detail on each of the findings. So it's a good place to go next if you're interested in more information. And if you'd like more than that, you can get into the details of the standard itself. And I'll talk about what we're working on for that later in the presentation. Processing large data sets. And as Jesse noted, a significant portion of the findings were either about the conversion software, the tooling, or what I call interoperability findings, which are basically findings generated from exchanging data sets between two different programming languages or tech stacks. So if we did everything in SAS, for example, we wouldn't find any real interoperability findings. But if a SAS programmer generated some Dataset-JSON, sent it to an R programmer, indeed, we may find some things that we need to adjust so that we can have that exchange without issue. So this particular one, processing large data sets, is about the conversion software. And I think anyone that's done much data engineering or data science work has experienced cases where solutions, they want to read in the entire data set into memory at one time. And this works as long as you have data sets that fit into memory. If you get a really large data set that's too big to fit into memory, you need another tactic to be able to deal with those. And with JSON, you may know that when you write a software program like these conversion tools to read in JSON, some libraries are going to want to read in the entire data set at once, but there are many out there that will read them incrementally. And those are the ones that we need to use for these Dataset-JSON conversion tools. And also fair to say that some of these were better than others. And so we had some uneven results. Now, the good news is that that feedback has made its way to the tool developers, and I think we've updated the tools such that now that this is no longer an issue. So one of the things that we'll do as part of the standards development team, even though the tools are really outside the purview of the standards development effort, is that we'll generate some test data sets and run those data sets again with the tools and generate some metrics that we can include in a user guide. Now, a user guide is a new addition to this version of the standard where we'll expand on things in the specification to help people better understand Dataset-JSON and how to apply it. So the tools have already been updated, and we'll help out with some documentation and testing. That said, we also made a standards adjustment. What we did is we added a new format called ND or New Line Delimited JSON as an alternative. So you can do straight up JSON or ND JSON. And ND JSON is different in that you write the JSON out one line at a time. Each line in the file represents a standalone JSON object essentially. And what you can do is then parse it a line at a time and interpret the JSON. So what that means is that really any JSON library should be able to process data sets of arbitrarily large sizes. So between the tooling update and the addition of ND JSONs, I think that this problem is taken care of. But again, we'll do some testing and reporting on this to make sure people understand how the open source tools that are converting Dataset-JSON into datasets and back, how they handle these larger files. Interoperability issue that came up very early in our discussions, in fact, came up during our first workshop. And this involves the exchange of integer-based dates like you find in an Atom dataset. In these cases, the integer dates are generated as the number of seconds from a date epoch, and that date epoch in R is January 1st, 1970, but in SAS it's January 1st, 1960. So those numbers, those integer-based dates, have a decade's worth of difference in the number itself. A key principle of data exchange is that the standard should be technology neutral. We should be able to say generate a data set based on a SAS programming language, convert Dataset-JSON, generate an R data frame, and have it work just fine. And so this particular issue is one that we needed to sort through to ensure that we're able to exchange information between technologies and programming languages without issue. After quite a bit of deliberation during our pilot workshops, we agreed that we would convert these integer-based dates into ISO 8601 date times so that they would be vendor neutral and unambiguous and even have the benefit of being human readable in the JSON format. To do that, we also needed to add an additional bit of metadata, additional attribute called target data type, so that in the metadata you've got, for that particular variable, you'll have a data type of date time, and then you'll have a target data type of integer. And that tells the conversion software that we're converting this integer-based date into an ISO 8601. And the receiver knows that this ISO 8601 date time's got to be converted back into an integer, and it will use the appropriate data epoch for that particular technology or programming language. So that's really how we addressed this particular finding, and it requires, of course, an update to the standards in that we're adding a new data type. So we have a date time data type now, as well as this new metadata target data type. The tooling will need to be updated because it will need to interpret that and understand what cases require them to convert a data type into a target data type. And lastly, because we know that date times are an area of some complexity, that we will add a user guide article to address some of the issues around or some of the best practices around dealing with date formats. So numbers and precision, that's another area of interoperability findings. Some testers commented that in cases where there were many digits after the decimal, that some of those latter ones were different. And not in a way that would create a statistical difference, but if you were testing those two numbers for equality, that you would indeed notice that they're not exactly the same. And during our pilot workshops, a number of folks noted that this really isn't a bug or a problem with Dataset-JSON. It's certainly not a Dataset-JSON issue because these differences are expected, and they're largely expected because these are interpreted as floating point numbers, and with floating point, we know that's not an exact representation. So between floating point and rounding differences in technologies, we'll see some of these differences. And we know, of course, that floating point is not an exact representation of a number, so some of these differences are expected. There are actually some good blog posts on the Farmiverse site that talk about floating point and rounding strategies, and in particular, the differences between SAS and R. So that's a good place to go if you're interested in learning a bit more about this topic. So not a data set problem. That said, we did add a new decimal data type. This came from ODM, the operational data model. And we did this because it provides a more exact representation of a number. So the idea here is what we do is wrap the number when it's represented in JSON in quotes. So it's treated as a string. So that means it won't be interpreted by the JSON library as a double. So it doesn't get converted into a floating point. It'll be passed as a string to the conversion program. And then the conversion program will determine the best way to apply that as a decimal data type, or the best approximation of the decimal data type that's available in that technology. So here, of course, we do have a standards update. We're adding new data type. We have a tooling update, and that some conversions are needed. And we also will talk about these issues in the user guide as well. Generally speaking, there were quite a few questions about data types, and quite a few of the findings themselves, in fact, were questions. Completely understandable, since Dataset-JSON is indeed a brand new standard and has quite a few more data types than SAS Transport, which of course only has 2. We also heard from a couple testers that the display format attribute was not meaningful if you were an R or a Python programmer. Indeed, display format represents SAS-centric content. So we will keep that as an optional attribute. We'll keep display format since it is useful to SAS programmers. But we've also added that target data type attribute that I mentioned earlier to carry vendor neutral content to indicate when a data type transformation is needed. So we'll be updating the standard with that new target data type attribute. The tools will need to know how to interpret data type and target data type and understand how to do those conversions. So they'll need to be updated as well. And of course, we will discuss data types in the new user guide, since many of these data types are new to some programmers. So this next one is yet another interoperability finding. In fact, encoding issues have popped up in every data exchange pilot I've been a part of, going back, let's say, to the Define XML 1.0 pilot, where I think almost all the original submissions had some encoding issues. For data exchange, I think this is really a feature, though, not a bug. The receiver of a data set needs to know what type of encoding was used to create it, and in order for it to effectively process it. And ideally, the conversion software will flag any encoding issues it finds. Dataset-JSON defaults to UTF-8 encoding, while SAS Transport uses ASCII-based encoding. So Dataset-JSON can cover many more characters, and it does support Unicode, so it can support lots of local languages, and ones that are not well supported are not supported by ASCII. One example of an encoding problem that's popped up quite a few times over the years are, amongst other characters, these smart quotes used by Microsoft that can be found in Word and Excel. And they are not really ASCII. They're part of an extended ASCII encoding scheme. So they're not UTF-8 and not ASCII. So when you find these in certain data sets or in Define or whatnot, yeah, they can get flagged as a problem and can cause problems for software systems trying to consume them downstream. So it's really important to be aware of the encoding schemes. Again, I do believe this is a feature. It's important for data exchange between different kinds of technologies. And so it's important for the conversion program to know whether or not they can effectively work with the data set that's provided in the character sets that they're, convert that into a native data set, or in fact, maybe load that into some software system, again, that needs to know that the encoding system is indeed aligned with what it can support. There are a number of questions about the Dataset-JSON metadata, as Dataset-JSON does carry a fair amount of metadata with it, and more metadata than you'll find in SAS version 5 transport. So some of the questions were just around, how do we use this particular attribute, and or when do we need to use it? So as part of the user guide, we'll add some guidance and best practices on the use of metadata in Dataset-JSON. In particular, we can provide some guidance on how and when to use those optional attributes, since they may not be required all the time. We got some questions about OIDs or object identifiers, and if you know define XML well, you're probably familiar with those. If not, they may be new to you, so that's something we'll expand on as well, and ask the toolings to maybe the conversion tools to optionally generate those so that it's not something that maybe necessarily need to deal with directly. Another question was around define XML. Is it required for Dataset-JSON? And this is an interesting question because it depends on really on the context. And for the pilot, of course, we're testing Dataset-JSON in the context of a regulatory submission. And remember, the only thing that changed here is the format of the dataset. So everything else in the submission would be the same, but instead of SAS transport, we use Dataset-JSON. So that's the only change. So in that context, yes, define is required because it's required for submissions. Generally speaking, though, define XML is optional for use with Dataset-JSON, and there are quite a number of data exchange use cases where it may not be included or really practical to use. I can think of one, such as a sponsor retrieving some data sets, say SETM plus or minus style data sets from an EDC vendor. And in that scenario, they might not have a define available, and that's fine. There'll be enough metadata in Dataset-JSON to be able to work with those data sets. Most important findings and talked about how we're going to address those findings in a new version of Dataset-JSON. Now I'm going to get into some of the specific next steps that we're taking. So one next step is to work with the open source conversion software tools to ensure that they get updated to support the latest version of the standard, the one that we're working on now. So as we get that standard completed, we'll reach out to the tool vendors and help them to ensure that we get the tools ready to go for work with the new version. It's important to note that these conversion tools, the SAS, R, and Python tools that were used for the pilot are all open source. They were all originally created as part of a CDISC COSA hackathon back in 2022. The authors graciously have continued to update these such that they perform well for the pilot and got us to a successful conclusion of the pilot. So we're thrilled about that. And indeed, as I've noted earlier, the standards development team will seek to help out with some of the testing and documenting of the latest version of the tooling. In addition to conversion tools, there's also a need for viewer software. And in fact, that did come out in the pilot findings. So while there are a couple of viewers out there, we'll look to add some more to those and make sure folks are aware of the viewers tools that are out there today. And generally speaking, the open source tools, they can always use contributors. So if there's an interest in testing or working with these tools, I'm sure if you reached out to them, they'd be happy to accept your feedback. So in terms of specific next steps, and these are, although listed sequentially, are really largely happening concurrently. So we finished the pilot report, like I mentioned, and that was published at the end of June, but we still have business case and strategy deliverables coming out of the project. And so there'll be documents that will be published shortly. We are, as I've noted a number of times, working on a new version of Dataset-JSON called version 1.1. And we're pushing hard to get that updated and done and published by the end of the year. So follow along if you're interested, and or you can get involved as well. Go out to the CDISC website and sign up if you're interested in participating in that effort. But that's underway, so keep your eye out for that. And again, a part of that will be the user guide to provide lots of additional information that'll help folks work with the standard effectively. Mentioned a few times, we'll be updating the conversion tools, looking for some viewer tools, and I'm sure, again, those authors appreciate any support they can get in terms of additional documentation, testing, and feedback, especially as we go through another round of updates. Next, we have a Dataset-JSON API specification that we've drafted. So this was not part of the pilot, and it's important to point out, but it is something that is an important component of Dataset-JSON in that providing a standard interface for API-based data exchange using Dataset-JSON will be probably the dominant way that Dataset-JSON is employed for data exchange. Now, not in the submission context, but in other contexts, that's where we believe that most data exchange will take place using APIs. And certainly we've heard that from the vendors that this is their preferred method for moving data around. So we do have a draft spec that's available for review, and we'll start to work on this as a standard after we get Dataset-JSON 1.1 published. And lastly, of course, we'll continue, now that the pilot is concluded, to collaborate with the regulators, FDA, PMDA, and others that have an interest in this and may have questions or requirements that they want to send our way. So I'm more than happy to continue the dialogue and keep pushing towards getting a Dataset-JSON version 1.1 that's ready for use, including for submissions. And with that, we will conclude and say thank you for your time and attention.